This is the Ted Wallachin Podcast. Brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Halenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Halenda's, the way sausage should taste. And now, here's Ted.
Beginning Wednesday, September 14th on CBC television, it's the premiere of a four-part documentary titled Summit 72, chronicling the most watched sporting event in Canadian television. It is, in fact, the 50th anniversary of the Team Canada and Team Soviet hockey series. This documentary is the only one, by the way, sanctioned and supported by the 1972 Team Canada players. Its writers, producers, and directors are an A-list team, including my guest this week, who is a multi-award-winning writer, producer, and director. Welcome, Robert MacAskil. Well, thanks for taking the time. First of all, congratulations on a brilliant documentary. It just blew me away. I loved every minute of it.
Oh, thank you very much, Ted. I'm one of four director-writers and one of two producers, led by Nick DePontier. So there's a number of key creatives and a lot of skilled people who have come together to bring this documentary to life. And as you've seen, a lot of it involves a lot of old archive film that has been restored to a 4K level. So we think the audience will get a lot out of that as well.
Let's talk about the four principles that were involved, the four key directors, producers,
Sure.
etc.
Well, Nick DePontier, who is a gifted and highly decorated director in Canada, was approached originally by Ken Dryden, I believe, to see if he wanted to take it on. I have done several documentaries about 72 and was involved in restoring the entire series of games as well, which have been lost for a number of years by the broadcast networks. They were, in fact, destroyed. So when Team 72's executive decided they wanted to deal with one production company, I had fancied putting together a production as well. Nick and I came together and basically partnered on the production. We have with us as well Dave Bedini, who has obviously from a different aspect of culture, but knows hockey extremely well and has written quite a few books on hockey. He's produced programs and documentaries about hockey as well. One of his books was about 72. He was a logical choice. And Ravi Beshwal, who is a Canadian working with ABC News in Chicago, tremendous storyteller. And he became our fourth director-writer on the series.
I mentioned at the intro of this program that it was the most watched sporting event in the history of Canadian television. In fact, Game 8, this boggles my mind. 90% of all television sets in Canada that were turned on were tuned into that final game. 90%, a 90 share, that is unprecedented. Nothing would do that today. Nothing.
Yes, and you and I are both of an age where we remember that day quite clearly. You know, it's often been referred to as Canada's moon landing. I was in school at the time. I had the television wheeled into the student lounge. We didn't have to stay in class that day. I think the entire school realized very little learning was going to be done from textbooks that day. It was going to be done from one another and watching what would happen in this tremendous drama that had unfolded in September 1972. And it is one of the reasons they refer to Canada coming to a standstill on that day. And, from some of the material we've been able to recover from CBC archives, you see even the National Ballet School brought a television into their class. And there are the kids in their tights and leotards watching Game 8.
It's an historic event. It's been documented on countless occasions in different forms. You take on a task such as this, how do you go about producing something that's fresh, something that will at least feel original or unique?
Well, that's a great question, because I think that was the number one question we certainly asked ourselves. And, I would have to commend our commissioning broadcaster, the CBC, for having the courage to take this on first and foremost, because as you just pointed out, this story has been done a number of times. Everyone's kind of familiar what they think the story is. But the CBC challenged us right from the get-go on trying to find stories that were not part of the mainstream culture and those who recounted what had happened. For instance, they asked us, is there an Indigenous story out there? Hadn't even considered that, having produced a number of documentaries about that. Never crossed my radar screen. So it forced us into looking, overturning, pages and leaflets and stones in the riverbed and whatnot to find certain stories. And we did find a very strong, and several actually profound stories. One of them that appears in episode 2 is with Chief Wilton Littlechild, who was on the delegation to visit Pope Francis in Rome, and was the gentleman who placed the headdress on the Pope when his return visit happened in Canada. And Chief Littlechild tells us about how hockey saved his life, and from residential school he realized it was the way to a better life, and it started his lifelong passion with hockey and his observations of 72 as well.
There's another great segment, an interview that's done with Carl Subban, who's PK Subban's dad, who was an educator here in Canada. How he was living, I believe, in Sudbury at the time, somewhere in Northern Ontario, and how this opened up the doors for him to play hockey with the white kids. He, of course, being a black young man at the time. And that series opened up so many doors that were really unimaginable at that time.
Well, and he's not alone. Farhan Lalji comes to mind as well. And, they kind of have a similar story, and they realized pretty quickly at the time hockey was really central to the culture of Canada. And if you wanted to understand Canada better than what one could from immigration leaflets and booklets and whatnot, you had to understand the culture of hockey. And once they began to explore that, they went, wow, hockey's kind of cool. Maybe we could play that as well. And so it allowed people who were new Canadians to have a little closer context to, those of us who were born and lived in Canada at the time, welcoming new Canadians to the country.
Back in 1972, the Cold War was at its peak. I mean, there were the Russians. Well, they weren't Russians, really. It was the Soviets versus Canada. It was capitalism versus communism. It was the bad guys versus the good guys. I mean, there was such a hatred going on, and that dissipated over the years. But now we see that it's come back. I mean, we see what's going on now with Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and in fact, you've included footage of recent footage of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. How important was that for this story?
Well, we tried to cast a very wide net, as you can see, and as part of our discussion is ensuing here. And certainly what you just pointed out is the reason it was done, because at the time, from fear comes a lack of understanding. And I think what the players and what we realized as Canadians through the 72 series and the days and years that followed is that there was an awful lot of things that we shared in common. Yes, there were tremendous differences, but there were, to a man, a lot of things that we had that were very similar. And we watched through Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika that the world started to open up to an extent, these two worlds. And a lot of it was taking place in the 70s with visits to Russia and to China, and certainly our own Prime Minister and Kosygin had several visits, which we also touch upon very briefly in the earlier parts of episode 2. And it was a bridge for people who didn't know one another, but had a degree of fear and lack of understanding about one another, to be able to discover some things that might alleviate some of those fears and distrust, because all of those things were there. unfortunately, as you just pointed out, the elastic band has shrunk and gone the other way. Um, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, has a leader that, would like to bring those, what he deems as the glory days of the Soviet Union back, and so has adopted policies that we had certainly seen in the post-World War II eras, through the Stalinist era and whatnot.
And on a lighter note, you brought back a couple of old Labatt 50 commercials with the stubbies, which that made me feel so good. I don't know, that's kind of strange to say that, but it did.
Well, it was always, they were one of the leaders. Certainly that category of advertising was a leader in lifestyle. And they're meaningful to us because they always remember, or we always remember when we saw them at the time and certainly see them today, how advertising kind of was evocative of that kind of free and open and fun lifestyle. And life has changed an awful lot. The world has changed over the past 50 years. And there was an opportunity for us to revisit what that culture was like, because we have tried very hard to bring as much culture into this story, as well as delivering the story of hockey at the time, as well as how hockey has changed around the world, and particularly for this country over the past 50 years.
My guest is Robert MacAskil. He's one of the producers of Summit 72, which airs on CBC. It's a 4-part documentary, brilliantly done, as I pointed out at the outset of this interview. You talk about the cultural differences and the shock that must have gone on, and I'm wondering who's more shocked, the Soviets coming to Canada or the Canadians going to the Soviet Union back then. And there's a great scene where a number of the Russian hockey players, Soviet hockey players, go into Sam the Record Man to buy, quote, illegal rock and roll albums because they were illegal back in the USSR.
Yeah. It's funny the way things happen. I think had the Munich Olympics not been occurring at the same time, the KGB and one of our interview subjects, Slava Nolmud, who is a former Russian journalist now living in North America, points out that without the Olympics going on at the time, the KGB would have had a lot more resources to do what they generally did when there were cultural exchanges. Certainly when Nureyev or Baryshnikov would come with the ballet, there was a lot of intense supervision of those artists, those dancers. And in 72, there was less of it. And Harlamov was kind of the ringleader of that crew. And because he was Valery Harlamov, he kind of was able to take a certain kind of, liberties that ordinarily players would not be allowed to do. And yes, rock and roll was banned in the Soviet Union at the time, but because he went, what are they going to do? Fire me? I'm the best player on the team. So let's go out, let's get some beers, let's go out and find some rock and roll music. We'll bring it home. And that's exactly what happened that day. And thankfully we have some photography to help support it.
And I talked to Paul Henderson about what it was like going to Russia, and he paints this dark picture of landing in Moscow and driving and seeing these apartment buildings, and all you saw was like one light on an apartment, and it was just a single bulb burning, and how dark and dank everything was, and how Canada had shipped over their own steaks and their own beer, and to him the biggest insult was, he says, they stole half our beer. How could they have done that?
Yeah, well, there's a black market there, so I'm sure that was part of it. Yeah. And also there were probably people, and I could not tell you, because we've asked a lot of questions over the years about this, and the Canadian players and Alan Eagleson all believe that, yes, things were stolen from the Canadian team, and it might have been to help support them. By the same token, though, they had an arena in Luzhniki Ice Palace that was just a grand palace, because this is what the Soviet Union did. They used sport to showcase what they believed the supremacy of the Soviet system. Yep. So, the Montreal Forum, Maple Leaf Gardens were our cathedrals of hockey, but they in no way compared to these marble-adorned walls and high ceilings and, large glass windows, natural wood seats, a palace that was fit for king hockey players.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
Well, it's time to visit our friend Tom Hollick at Kensington Market, the heart of Kensington Market, 190 Baldwin. That's where you'll find Tom's Place. And in Tom's Place, a vast selection of fabulous clothing, not just suits. We talk about suits a lot, but you've got a terrific selection of all kinds of shirts, casual shirts, dress shirts, beautiful cashmere sweaters, too. I love the sweaters.
And then we have those total zip-ups up and down. We have those fine knits that you can wear under your sport jacket. We have Mason sport pants. We also have Bragg sport pants, wonderful shirts, amazing selection of early fall sport jackets. When you come to Tom's Place, be prepared that you will find a vast selection of top quality sportswear.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking for a wonderful fall coat or a raincoat, Tom's Place has it. Ted, earlier you said to me, what should we talk about? I said the birds and the bees and, of course, Tom's Place clothing. There's nothing like it.
Exactly. So Brack's pants, I'm in the market. I'm coming down in a couple of days and bringing a good friend, a young friend of mine, who's getting ready for a wedding. He needs to buy a brand new suit, so he'll grab a suit. I'll grab some pants from you, and everybody will be happy. Look forward to seeing you again soon, Tom.
Thank you.
190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market is where you'll find Tom's Place. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Wallachin.
Russia has won the World Hockey Championship for the 5th time.
The thing that really bothered me was that we knew Canada was the best hockey country in the world. We knew we had the best players. And yet, the Russians were called the world champions. They were the world champions. We were the best. I mean, that's not right.
The documentary opens up, I think it's a brilliant opening, not to overuse that word, but it starts off with footage, historic footage, black and white, I believe, of the Soviet hockey team with the CCCP written across the jersey, and they're celebrating. And for anybody who's a fan of Canadian hockey or a fan of the good versus the bad, it immediately gets your blood boiling right at the beginning, opening scene, episode number 1, to think, yeah, those guys think they were the best. It was the amateurs versus the pros. Well, they were about as amateur as you are. They were paid Soviet hockey players, is what they were, part of the Red Army.
Yeah, there was absolutely nothing amateur about the Soviet national team. That was part of the way they would try to characterize themselves, because they weren't paid by a free open market system. As you aptly point out, Ted, they were members of the Red Army. They were lived and housed and fed 11 months a year on Red Army properties. They played hockey, I believe it was twice a day, and an enormous amount of dry land training and indoor training, constant training. It was a full-time job, but it was convenient, and it was drilled into the heads of the players that they were still amateurs, and it was the Canadians who played in the NHL and received, substantial salaries, relatively speaking, certainly nothing to what we see today in terms of pro sport. Excuse me, but it was a convenient way of them trying to play the role of the underdog. And of course, we all know from certainly the end of period 1 on that there was very little about the Soviet national team that measured in the realm of underdog.
And boy, did we underestimate them. Boy, I mean, the world. I was in Europe at the time, and I remember reading one of the newspapers. I think we were in Belgium at the time, and the headline read something like "Professionals embarrassed by amateurs." Some words to that effect, and that's essentially what it was. I mean, we were embarrassed, and as Ken Dryden points out, it was our party, and it was supposed to be our party, and we were ruining it for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's one of the interesting things about the series. I think the entire country shared in that humiliation, and it was way beyond embarrassment. It was a complete dressing down, and it was an awakening as well. And we didn't believe at the time that anybody could match the skill level of the Canadian hockey player, which was certainly 99 plus whatever percent of NHL content at the time. It was all Canadian players virtually. And these guys come along. Yeah, we didn't really watch World Championships to the extent that maybe we do today. Even Olympic hockey was not that important to Canadians because our best guys were in the NHL, and they played for the Leafs and the Habs and the Blackhawks and the Rangers and Bruins and the Red Wings, of course, if I'm going to go through all the principals from the pre-expansion era. But I think we all realized at that time during that game that things would never be the same again, because suddenly there was a new kid on the block, and they knew things about this game that we had never experienced before. Certainly the style of play and puck movement, the way the strategy was played out. Canadians would watch them come up and they didn't like their rush. They would turn around and go back. That just didn't happen at the time in NHL hockey.
I was really surprised, Robert. I was really surprised to see how. I mean, we didn't gel as a team until really the second half of the series, after we'd gone and played some exhibition games in Sweden. But the animosity that existed amongst players on Team Canada, because it was guys were saying, "Well, wait a minute, I play for the Boston Bruins, and I got this guy from the New York Rangers, and I hate those guys, and he's playing on the wing beside me. How am I supposed to get along with this guy?"
Yeah, very few of us really realize the extent of that animosity between the Canadian players who played for various NHL teams. We've come to know that over the years now that guys have given interviews and brought us that level of insight. But it was not as though I didn't like the guy. I think you just hit the nail on the head. I hated that guy. I remember Fergie telling me when he would come to Toronto to play the Leafs, if he went out for a steak and a Maple Leaf came in before, and the steak is a really important pregame meal for John Ferguson. Yeah, he would put his 20 on the table and up he would go before the steak even arrived. And it was just, I cannot be in the same restaurant of these guys. Just like there used to be in the very old days in the 50s, lots of brawls on the trains, when they were going back and forth between Montreal and Toronto. They really, really hated the members of the other team. And that was one of the tremendous challenges that Harry Sinden had to deal with at training camp. How do you make these guys who were enemies a few months ago now become best brothers and represent your country and go to war and carry the Canadian flag on your back or on your jersey in this case?
Talking to Robert MacAskil, who's one of the producers of the upcoming CBC documentary series titled Summit 72. Is there anything, or were there some specific things that you learned, that you discovered, that took you aback, that you didn't realize prior to sitting down to work on this documentary?
I think I would even extend beyond this documentary, and it was the notion of the shared victory has always been something for a Canadian that's been hard for me to grapple with. I first heard the Soviet players when I interviewed them many, many years ago for a different project, and talk about how Canada was not the only winner in this series. And we as Canadians, we revere this goal and this moment as being the moment where we won the series. But as Ken Dryden points out in the documentary and in his book, which is just being released now, we both wanted certain things that we didn't get, but we certainly got what we needed. And the Soviets feel that they don't so much talk about we won respectability. They talk about hockey winning. But I know behind that is the fact that they got to go toe-to-toe with the Canadians and they maintained respectability. And that was what the directive, that's what the directive was that was given to them at the outset by the Soviet state authorities. Don't embarrass the country. We expect you to lose, but lose respectably and try and win a few games. Well, after the Game 1 7-3 blowout, all of that changed. And suddenly now they realize at the outset of the series that they can match the Canadians and they can beat the Canadians. And so I think that was part of their victory. With us, with our backs against the wall, when we left the Canadian leg of the series, after 4 games, only 1 victory, then you go to Moscow and you lose the first of 4 games there. How do you pull that out? And I think that's what gripped the country so dramatically, and why after all of the things that occurred through the course of those remaining games, especially Game 8 and the lead up to Game 8 with the referee change and some of the other things that went on, the fact that we could pull this out at the end with a goal by Paul Henderson and the leadership of Phil Esposito, Sinan, and the rest of the team, I think we learned an awful lot from that. And that was our victory, not just the fact that we wound up on top of the score sheet, but the fact that we discovered something about ourselves, and that is that when the chips are down, we'll keep going at it until we either die trying or we come back with the victory, which is what we did in this case.
And I wonder who was the teacher and who was the student in terms of lessons taught and lessons learned. And by that I mean, go to Game 4 in Vancouver, and the crowd is booing Team Canada. Esposito freaks out in an interview with Johnny Esau, starts complaining. He says, "Listen, we're busting our butts out here, and you people are booing us." And it's like they're trying to. We're making the team feel bad. The team's making the viewers feel bad. And then everybody goes over to the Soviet Union, and suddenly Peter Mahovlich is in tears because he can't believe the crowd is singing "Oh Canada" so loud and with such passion that it literally brings him to tears. Who is teaching whom?
Well, not to get too abstract, I love your question, and so my answer is going to be: we were all the students, players on both teams, both systems, countrymen of both countries. We were the students. Who was the teacher? It was hockey, you know. And I think it's from experiencing that series and the game that we felt so passionate about and believed that we were, if not the originator of the game itself, certainly one of them, that is what led to the learning. And so, if I could be a little bit abstract in answering your question, I would credit hockey and the 72 series as being the teacher and everybody else who observed it as the student. Because we all learned something.
Well, I think one lesson that everybody learned, hockey players and hockey fans and people in general, is, boy, do your homework and be prepared because, as I mentioned, not only physically were we not prepared, we didn't do our homework properly. Our scouts had indicated that Tretiak was a terrible goalie. And the reason that they say that is because they saw him in an exhibition game, but he was playing the day after his wedding. So the guy's seriously hungover, and he's playing like garbage. And they're thinking, this Tretiak guy's nothing. And turns out, well, hardly.
Well, I think that was another one of our learnings, too, because in hindsight, when, I didn't know what Johnny McClellan's scouting report was like or his experience, but I think what we realized is that there were a lot of sneaky tactics that were employed by the Soviets. And certainly that was one of them, to send a goalie out who was far from being in game shape and probably a little bit hungover. And Tretiak has acknowledged himself that it was a bit of a trick, and we didn't realize it. And the word came back from Johnny and Bob Davidson, who was with him, that the Russian goalie, couldn't stop a beach ball. Well, And that leads Ken Dryden's comment to say, we expected him to be a weakness, but he wasn't. There was a reason why Vladislav Tretiak is in the Hockey Hall of Fame to this day, because he was an exceptional goaltender and he worked so hard. And that is another thing that we learned, and another area where the game changed. Back in those days, players would show up, they'd have had a good summer, there have been a few barbecues and a few beers, and they would play themselves into shape through the first half of the season and get ready for the playoffs. That doesn't happen today. If you want to be an NHL hockey player, you've got to be in top condition at all times. And when you go through the various things that they do with the scouts and the combine and whatnot, you're measured intensely with everything that you can do physically, and your endurance and stamina, as well as your ability, your strength, it's an example of how things changed in North America from the 72 series.
You mentioned at the outset of the interview, Robert, how you watched this when you were a student in school, and you watched the series, and obviously as the momentum built, and by the time we got to Game 8 and Henderson scored that goal, again, for those of you not familiar with it, Henderson scored the winning goal in Game 6, 7, and 8, not just Game 8. It was like a Disney film. It was something like, it's like, this is not humanly possible. When you were doing this documentary, when you're going through the editing and the researching, etc., by the time you finished, did you get that same kind of satisfaction? It seems sort of, wow, it's over, and boy, was that exciting.
Well, for me personally, and I think I could speak for the other directors on this series as well. I think the fact that we brought a different view to the 72 series that had ever been done before. Mm-hmm. We've talked more culture, we talked immigration, we talked people who are not of the same background, race, and religion, all being on a common objective to support the country and the players wherever they could to help win this series. And you a moment ago had talked about Game 4 being booed out of the arena, not by everybody, but by a substantial amount of the crowd. And yes, they were booing Canada, but they were also cheering the Soviets because they liked what they saw. They liked the skill. Now, go to Game 5, there's 3,000 Canadians who have paid out of pocket to take a trip behind the Iron Curtain to go support their team in Moscow. It was the largest single sporting event held by the Soviet Union where they allowed that many foreign nationals, to enter the country. So precedent setting there as well. And they were expected to win that game, and Henderson would have scored the winning goal in that game had the wheels not come off in the third period. And yet, despite that, the Canadian fans, the 3,000 that were there, spontaneously stand and sing "O Canada" as the team leaves the ice going, my God, we're going to win. What are we going to do to win this series now? Because after 5 games, they only have 1 victory. So they absolutely have to win all 3 remaining games, and they have to play all 3 games, and there can't be another tie. Backs against the wall. So I think we all have something to take from on that, and it's great being able to bring that culture and that story and that sensibility to a younger audience today, who many of whom, talk about the 72 series. We had one bright young person on our crew who hadn't equated Russia with the Soviet Union. Now, that really surprised me because, those were things that were synonymous for those of us who lived through it. And yet, here's a 20-something who is a studious person, exceptionally talented at what he does, but just didn't have that level of depth in his own personal history. So the fact that we've been able to bring people to this era and to this story that changed hockey forever, I think is one of the more rewarding things for any of us that have been in the series.
Well, and in keeping that in mind too, that there were players whose families had come from parts of the Soviet Union, thinking like the Mahavlich brothers, for example, or Stan Mikita. This meant a lot more to them than it did to a Ron Ellis or to a Paul Henderson, for example.
Yes, and not to diminish that it didn't mean a lot to Ron Ellis or Paul Henderson or anybody, but you're quite right. And it's why the game in Prague was played. You mentioned Stan Mikita, who didn't get a lot of ice time, exceptional hockey player, but it just didn't work in the line combinations that Harry resolved towards, as the series grew on. But they felt they had to play Game 9 for Mikita. And fans have told us, when we sat down with Eddie Johnson and his wife said, when we got to Prague, we just wanted to go home, but we were so well accepted by the Czech people that they were giving us Crystal because we had beat the Soviets. And the Soviets had been, so characteristically autocratic to them for having taken over their country in '68 that, they revered the Canadians for what they had accomplished in the series, and they didn't see a shared victory from their standpoint. So that meant a lot. And Frank, I'm told that Frank was just driven crazy. And there was a story about the chandelier that Frank thought was a bug in his room. Pete has kind of said that maybe didn't quite happen the way it's been, told year after year or decade after decade. Yeah. But he knew the autocracy and what the KGB was capable of doing and how people could disappear if they did the wrong things, which is just something we didn't recognize in our country for all its faults at the time. And, we still have our faults, but, we do live, relatively speaking, in a much freer society where we can protest in the streets and we can have a voice and we can disagree with things that go on within our society and yet not be punished or sent away to prison or poisoned for it.
Yeah, it kind of makes you laugh when you hear about people when they start referring to our government as communists and how we live in a fascist state. And you think, oh, you have no idea what goes on in the rest of this world. The documentary is so entertaining, so educational on so many different levels, Robert. I hope that everybody gets an opportunity to see it, whether you're a hockey fan or not. It says so much about our history. It teaches us so much about what Canada is like right now and how inclusive we have become and are continuing to be so. And again, for anybody who's listening now, you have to see this thing. All 4 episodes. And again, Robert, congratulations to you and your entire team. Terrific work.
Thank you, Ted. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you again.
The Ted Wallacham Podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And Helenda's, the meat people. Enjoy their award-winning products at selected Metro, Sobeys, Fortino's, and Foodland locations. Helenda's, the way sausage should taste. The Ted Wallacham Podcast is produced by Joey Roselli. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. I'm Becky Coles. Submit your questions and comments to ted@twmedia.ca.